Welcome to the second lecture in our 6th week of Church History 500. These are the beta lectures. And in this lecture we are going to discuss how Christianity entered China. And as a result of this lecture, I would expect the student to describe the various phases of Christianity in early China, to explore how the Christian faith was transplanted. What did it look like in China? How was it different? How was it the same? And I want the student to evaluate the import of Nestorian Christianity in China. So let's begin by talking about just some general observations of Christianity in China. The Jesuits arrived in China in the 15th century, and they found Jews in China, but they did not find any Christians. Marco Polo reported no Christians in China. So if there were Christians in China before the 15th century Jesuits, there didn't really seem to be any church to show for. But in 1623, when people were digging in the Xi'an capital Xi'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty, they uncovered a 9-foot tall, 3-foot wide stela. It was called a monument commemorating the propagation of the Ta-Chin Syrian luminous religion in China. It was erected in AD 781, and it commemorated the arrival of a Nestorian missionary in AD 635. So let's look at the political and geographical context of China back in that 7th century to understand, okay, how did Christianity get from the Mediterranean, the Church of the East, past India, all the way into China? We have to remember that China was protected by its Great Wall, and outside that Great Wall there were a number of nomadic tribes, fierce horsemen. When we look at the trajectory of the gospel in Rome in the west, we see the gospel going from Rome, the center, out to the barbarian tribes. In China, we see the gospel coming from the barbarian tribes into China proper. And there were times of relative stability in the Silk Road trade, right? This exchange of goods and ideas. And by the 3rd century AD, the power had shifted to a coalition of outer tribes known as the Mongol Xianpei tribes. And I do apologize for my pronunciation. I do not pretend to know how all of this is supposed to be pronounced. In the 5th century, the Mongol Zhuang tribe dominated and moved from Manchuria into China. So we see that the Mongols are different tribes, and they're moving from the outside towards the center. In the 6th century, the two Chua Turks overthrew the Zhuangs, but China within the wall was dominated by a different group of Turks, the Toba Turks. Although they were thoroughly Sinicized, they were thoroughly culturally adapted to China, and they became strongly Buddhist. Some of the earliest contact that we know between the West and China goes as far back as AD 455, where a Persian embassy, a Persian envoy arrived outside the walls of China during the Wei dynasty. In AD 551, Procopius and Theophanes reported the arrival of Nestorian monks from the east to Justinian in Constantinople with gifts of silkworms in a bamboo tube. The power of the nomadic tribes outside the walls were waning, and China grew more unified and powerful, allowing them to pursue relationships with the West. In AD 589, the establishment of the Sui dynasty, which was short-lived, prepared the way for the great Tang dynasty, and that dates from about AD 618 to 907. So the founder of the Tang dynasty was Li Yuan, or Cao Sung, who was half Turk and led with the help of a Turkish cavalry. And his mother was actually described as a Nestorian Christian. But the entrance of Christianity into China proper comes through a missionary in the 7th century named Alapin. Alapin was the missionary that the Xi'an Stela was commemorating. So let me read from the Xi'an Stela. When the accomplished Emperor Taizong, AD 627 to 649, began his magnificent career in glory and splendor, behold, there was a highly virtuous man named Alapin in the kingdom of Ta-Chin. Auguring from the azure sky, he decided to carry on the true sutras with him. And observing the course of the winds, he made his way through difficulties and perils. Thus, in the 9th year of the period named Qiancheng, AD 635, he arrived in Chang'an. The emperor dispatched his minister, Duke Fang Xuanling, with a guard of honor to the western suburb to meet the visitor and conduct him into the palace. The sutras were translated in the imperial library. His Majesty investigated the way in his own forbidden apartments, and being deeply convinced of its correctness and truth, he gave special orders for its propagation. Xi'an Stela continues to give a long list of Persian and Syrian missionaries. Alapin was probably not the first Christian in China, since China had been trading with the Sasanian Persians since the 5th century, and Nestorians were prevalent in the merchant class in Persia. And there were other contexts. An ambiguous mention of a Mar Sergis from a prominent Western family was known to be a Nestorian Christian. But in AD 635, Alapin arrives in China. And if he had come just 10 years earlier, he may have been expelled by the Tang Emperor Cao-Tzu. Cao-Tzu I thought Buddhism was Western and anti-Chinese, which is something that we usually don't think of, but Buddhism actually started west of China proper. So if Cao-Tzu thought Buddhism was too Western, chances are he would have regarded Christianity as too Western. He said the Buddha was of the West. His words were mischievous, and he was far from us. In AD 626, Cao-Tzu's second son, Taizong, took the throne with the help of Buddhist monks and instituted a period of toleration, which allowed Buddhism to grow and Christianity to grow. In the interest of stability, this toleration allowed him to balance Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, and he issued a universal edict of toleration. Let me read from that. The way, Christianity, had not in all times and all places the selfsame name. The sage had not in all times and all places the selfsame human body. Heaven caused a suitable religion to be instituted for every region and clime so that each one of the races of mankind might be saved. Bishop Alapin of the kingdom of Ta-Chin, bringing with him the sutras and images, has come from afar and presented them at our capital. Having carefully examined the scope of his teaching, we find it to be mysteriously spiritual and of silent operation. Having observed its principles and most essential points, we reach the conclusion that they cover all that is most important in life. Their language is free from perplexing expressions. Their principles are so simple that they remain as the fish would remain if the net of language were forgotten. This teaching is helpful to all creatures and beneficial to all men, so let it have free course throughout the empire. It's fascinating. This act of toleration, which was probably a political move towards unity instead of theological endorsement of Christianity, coincided with this explosion of learning in the Tang Dynasty. Tang Dynasty built a library of over 200,000 volumes, and eclipsing the holdings of the Library of Alexandria. And in AD 638, the year of the Edict of Toleration, the first Christian church was built in China. So even though Alapin may not have been the first Christian to ever have contact with China, his arrival in 635 did spark something new in China. After the initial entrance into China, Christianity experienced a period of about a half century of persecution. When Taisung died, his son Kaosung followed in his father's footsteps and actually showed favor to Nestorian Christianity. And from this period, we do have records of 11 different Christian churches already in China. Alapin gained the title the Great Patron and Spiritual Lord of the Empire. And as a recognition of being made a bishop by the bishop of Ctesiphon. So the bishop of Ctesiphon made Alapin the bishop of China, basically. And despite his favor to Christians, Kaosung took in one of his father's concubines, which is interesting because concubinage is a sin in Christianity, Buddhism, and Confucianism. And the woman that he took in was known as Wu Hu or Wu Chao. And after being sent to a nunnery on the death of her husband, she seduced the son and re-entered court, giving the emperor a son. So she was banished from court. When her husband who banished her died, it seems like she took up with her son and gave him a son, even though he already had another wife. To show how deceitful this woman was, she murdered her own son so that she can blame it on the queen, so that she got the queen executed. Not just executed, but got her hands and feet chopped off as well. Now Wu Chao dominated Kaosung and ran the Chinese government. She deposed two of her sons when they succeeded her father and established a new dynasty in her name and became violently pro-Buddhist. So the persecution of Christians began in AD 698 when mobs attacked a church in the eastern capital of Luoyang, which was a Buddhist stronghold. So under the usurper queen Wu Chao and her pro-Buddhist vision, Christians became persecuted. But this was followed by a recovery of the church. Despite her wickedness, Wu Chao held the empire together, which deteriorated until her grandson, Xuanzang, who was the longest ruling empire in the Tang dynasty. And this was a period of gradual recovery for the church, even though it was a period of gradual decline for the Chinese empire. And one of the reasons for this is the rise of Islam. When Islam swept across Central Asia, the Persian Shah sought help from China because he saw he was going to get overrun by these Muslims. China refused to give Persia military aid, but gave asylum to the Shah's family after the Shah was killed. China was not worried about the Arabs yet. They were still quite a ways away. They were still focused on the threat of the northern tribes. And that's why China refused to go to war against Islam with Persia, because they had threats closer to home to worry about. Muslims were unexpectedly tolerant of Christians in Persia, mainly because they were focused on persecuting the Zoroastrians. And some say the Islamic sweep across Central Asia pushed Christians further afield, stimulating more missionary activity in Central Asia. If we can go back to the West for a second, in AD 732, Charles the Hammer Martel, which we will discuss in our next lecture, stopped the westward advance of Islam. So at this point, Islam controlled everything from Vienna, basically just east of Vienna, through India. And Charles Martel ensured that Islam could not go any further west. They only had one direction to go, and that was east, right? So now it set up this imperial showdown because this rising Islam in the west and China in the east. And in AD 751, the Battle of Talas, the Arabs beat the Chinese, starting the Chinese imperial decline. So the church in China between AD 712 and AD 781 was a period of flourishing because the government had other problems to worry about, right? New missionaries arrived in China from Persia and were invited to say Mass in the Chinese palace. The nickname for Christianity shifted from the Persian religion to the Syrian religion. And after Xuanzang's abdication, the decline started in earnest. We had three foreign religions flourishing in China: Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. But very soon, Christianity would disappear from China. So between 781 and 980, we see Christianity fall off the Chinese map. There could be several different reasons for this that scholars debate. Between the erection of the Nestorian tablet in AD 781, which commemorated an event that happened 150 years prior, and the fall of the Tang dynasty, Christianity dried up in China. The Arab record of the 10th century attests to the disappearance of Christianity from China. By the 11th century, there is no mention of Christianity except in the past tense. And there are four different types of reasons we can talk about for Christianity's disappearance there. One can be religious. There was religious persecution of outsiders between AD 840 and 846. And these persecutions included Christians, Uyghurs, and Buddhists. Uyghurs fled into China, prompting persecution of their Manichaeism. The Buddhists suffered the most, though. And if Buddhism, which was the majority religion, suffered and never really rebounded, Christianity did not have the same resources and similarly faltered. Another set of reasons we can talk about for the disappearance of Christianity in China are theological. And this brings up a difficult but important conversation. How Nestorian was Chinese Christianity in this period? In our last lecture, we talked extensively about how Nestorianism can mean many different things. It can mean the use of a two physis formula, but then again, Chalcedon adopted that same formula later on. It could mean the theological understanding of Jesus as two persons. That is heretical, right? Whereas the formula that is used is not necessarily heretical. That's open to a bunch of different understandings. So as a result, we have quotes. I believe this is from Hughes. There's virtually nothing in the documents that can be conclusively labeled Nestorianist, even by the standards of Chalcedonian Orthodoxy of Constantinople and Rome. So it seems like the person of Christ that this Nestorian Christianity promoted was not did not violate the Chalcedonian definition. Yet at the same time, the Nestorian Christianity of China did mention Mary as the mother of Christ, Christotokos. So we can conclude that the Nestorian missionaries that went from Persia to China were essentially Orthodox. There is one possible exception. One text does refer to Jesus as divided by nature or divided by person, and textually it's almost impossible to figure out which one they mean there. So even that is not conclusive evidence that they rejected Chalcedonian orthodoxy. The Chinese Book of Praise states, above three persons uniting together in one and the same body. So we see Trinitarian language there, almost Nicene language. Alapin brought in a sutra, a book. And we have today the Jesus Messiah Sutra, and it may have been written by Alapin himself. And it is this introduction to two basic doctrines. God is Lord of life and human nature as sinful. It says about original sin. Sin came into the world because our original ancestor committed the sin of disobedience in the garden of seed and fruit-bearing trees. Right? It gives an interpretation of the Ten Commandments of ethics and the gospel. Let me read a short section of the Jesus Messiah Sutra. God made the cool wind to enter the virgin named Mo-Yen, Mary. He thus made clear his power so that all might believe and return to a good relation. Mary bore a son named Ishu, Jesus, the Messiah. He was baptized by John, and a voice sounded, "The Messiah is my son. His will is to lead all to give up their false gods." He gathered 12 disciples, raised the dead to life, gave sight to the blind, healed the sick, and cast out devils. But those who did not believe accused him falsely and brought him before Pilosutsu, Pilate, who said, "I cannot see any crime deserving of death. I cannot kill this man." But the wicked ones forced him to sentence Jesus to death. So the Messiah gave up his body to be sacrificed for the sake of all mankind, suffering death for them. They bound him upon the tree between two highwaymen. The earth quaked, and the mountains were rent, and all the gates of graves in the world were opened. Seeing these things, how can anyone say that he does not believe what is taught in the sutras? Those who live or die for the sake of the Messiah are faithful believers. So it seems as if the Nestorian Christianity brought by the Persians, was of the Orthodox variety. However, this is not universally agreed by historians. A historian named Leged responded to the question, why did Nestorianism fail in China? His response was, well, how could it succeed? It had no gospel in it. But when we look at the Chinese Christian texts, it seems like there was gospel in it. The fourth Alepan document, the Discourse on Almsgiving, explains that salvation comes through Christ alone. Now, we have to admit that there was a significant amount of compromise between Chinese Nestorian Christianity and Chinese culture, specifically Buddhism. Sometimes God was referred to as the Buddha in Christian documents. And this might be a lapse in communication, but the Persians had been in contact with China long enough to know who the Buddha was and to know what that would mean to the Chinese. We see that the Xian Stela speaks clearly of the Trinity, and I quote, "There is one, the origin of origins, our Aloha, God, the triune mysterious person. It contains orthodox teachings on creation, sin, fall, and salvation." But the section on salvation, when it talks about Christian ethics, actually draws a lot on Buddhist and Confucian ethical virtues. There are some troubling omissions in it. There is no mention of Christ's death or resurrection or the centrality of the scriptures. And I believe this quote comes from Hughes. "From the limited evidence available, Tang Dynasty Christianity was neither heretically Nestorian nor fatally syncretistic." In other words, there was the true gospel there, even if there were things that might muddy those waters. So we talked about some religious reasons for the disappearance of Christianity, some theological reasons. There were some political reasons as well. The Christian church in China was a church of foreigners. Its missionaries were Persians, and the names on the stela were almost entirely in Syriac. Sometimes they come from border tribes, right? So the best explanation for the disappearance of Christianity was the fall of the Tang Dynasty and the An Lushan Rebellion in AD 756. That would not be the end of the story of Christianity in China, but from the 8th or 9th century through the 15th century, it seems as if Christianity was completely absent. Thank you.